what I want to talk about this week is primarily FDR's enemies. But before I get into that, next week we're going to start talking about FDR's some of his friends, and I want to talk about just people, Henry Wallace and people like that, Grace Tully. But next Wednesday night at 7 o'clock, so write this down, we're going to have that presentation from Catherine Smith. She's going to be zooming in all the way from South Carolina, and she wrote this wonderful book. I can find my copy. There it is. Called The Gatekeeper. And it's a wonderful book, easy to read. Amazon's kind of, they're only like a week and a half out now, so you can get this relatively short order. But if you want to read it, Catherine's going to have a system set up where you can get a copy from her, and she'll sign it for you. This is really a fascinating history book, and I really appreciate her willingness to do her talk. So what she'll do, and we can bring her on next Wednesday night, she will be in character as Missy LeHand for the first bit. So she'll be talking as if she were Missy LeHand, and then she'd be happy to answer questions for anybody afterwards. But so next week you have to put up another after hour of me as well. Not of me, I'm just organizing this one. So that'll be next Wednesday night at 7. I will start sending the link around about 6:30, and just click in if you want. It shouldn't take more than an hour. I feel bad that she can't come. We are so excited to have her come to Maine and do her talk here at the library. That was going to be a great thing, but oh well. Other things have happened. So that'll be next Wednesday night at 7 o'clock. So mark that down. All right. So what we talk about today, and when I think about FDR's enemies, I mean, they were pretty virulent, some of them. And I always remember the story of the guy who went walking down the street in New York City every day in the 30s, and he would stop at the newspaper stand and pick up the paper, look at it, put it down, and walk off. He did this day after day after day. And finally, one day, the guy who owned the newsstand said, "Sir, can I help you? You seem to be looking for something." He says, "Well, I'm just trying to find the obituaries in the paper." I said, "Sir, the obituaries in the paper, they're on page 15. You never even open the paper. You just look at it and put it down. They're like way back in the back of the paper." He says, "Nah, when the son of a bitch I'm looking for dies, it's going to be front page news." And that's a good story of just how some people, with the Roosevelts, you don't have people that, people either loved them or hated them. And that, I think that kind of leadership brings out that kind of split personality and affection for people like that, because it's so dynamic and so forceful that it impacts people's lives, and you either think it's a great idea what he's doing or a horrible idea what he's doing. And I think that's part of the process. So anyway, I want to talk about some of his enemies today. They were numerous. Some of them were in a place to make things very difficult for the Roosevelts and their administration. Some of them tried. Some of them were a great threat to the country, I think. Part of what I'll do today is actually play some sound excerpts from some of these folks. You can hear what they sounded like, perhaps hear why people felt so compelled to follow them. I can't imagine how these people would have survived today with our media culture the way we have it, with it's all Instagram and Facebook, and everybody's filming everything on your phones. It'd be a whole different dynamic of getting your message out. But back then, the main medium was what? What was the medium for communication?
Newspapers.
And radio was starting to really kick in. So some of these folks, I want to talk about a couple of these. So you have people that ran against Roosevelt for president. In 1936, it was Alf Landon from Kansas. He was a decent fundamental guy. But then in 1940, you had, I think, one of the more fascinating people in history to be involved in politics, and that was Wendell Willkie. Wendell Willkie was an interesting fellow. He was kind of a non-entity for a while, not really well known, but he somehow got the nomination for president in 1940 for the Republicans. Up till 1939, he had been a Democrat. And by and large, he supported the New Deal policies. He thought they were mostly good, but ambition kind of take over. He was born in Indiana, had served in World War I, was a lawyer, was a utility lawyer, well-respected, brilliant. He combined, I think, some of the best oratorical skills you could ever come across with kind of an aw shucks, down-home, hayseed attitude from Indiana that really appealed to people. They noticed it wasn't front. It wasn't, God love John Kerry for being who John Kerry is, but when he was trying to act like he was a hunter, you can't go hunting with Bruno Magli shoes and $1,000 slacks with an Ella Bean coat for the first time. It just doesn't go well. People suspected that Wendell Willkie was who Wendell Willkie was. He was the real deal, which is part of what I think makes him a threat to Roosevelt. Because people look at Wendell Willkie and go, this guy's real. This guy, I like this guy. He is who he says he is. But he was kind of a nobody. He was an attorney people knew, but he ended up having people in the right places, and he knew people in the establishment, and he knew people in the media world, and they liked him. They kind of started putting stories out about him. Now, the dominant Republican at the time in 1940 was Thomas Dewey from New York, the governor of New York, who had a reputation for putting away bad guys. And that was an interesting aspect to follow. That's kind of, Rudy Giuliani did the same thing. He kind of used his crime-fighting skills and what he did as an attorney as a way to get involved in politics. So Dewey was the same way in 1940. But Willkie came along, rode a bandwagon of just amazing, quick stories and popular press that he goes into the convention for the Republicans, and it's kind of a three-way race. And he's got people doing the right staging. He's got people doing the right planning. And suddenly he takes out the number one guy, and he becomes the nominee for president of the United States. Ironically, President Trump has said that if you want to understand him, you have to understand Wendell Willkie, or something to that effect. I don't agree with that, because I think Wendell Willkie is a different kettle of fish altogether, as my father-in-law would say. Let me play you a little clip of some Wendell Willkie speech. I have all my different technology on here for me. Tell me what you think. You think he sounds...
Why, because they were weak economically. They had a blue government and a Chamberlain government. You're like me for the United States, and we'll build a domestic economy here so strong that no dictator ever shall seek to strike. And let me say in conclusion, that I, who saw service during the entire period of the last war, and I know what it is to then send men to the shambles of trenches. If you elect me President of the United States, I shall never send an American boy to fight in any European war.
Interesting. That is the battle cry of the 1940 campaign, right? That's why the Republicans are running. They see what's coming in the world, and they don't want to be involved in that. A whole generation of, particularly Europeans, has been wiped off the face of the earth because of that war. There's a genuine fear for that. And when it starts, we'll talk about this in a couple weeks, the whole Lend-Lease program gets going. It's Roosevelt's way to get ready to help the British out. He's kind of inching that way. He's trying to be delicate about it. And Willkie really goes after him on that stuff for a while in 1940. Like I said, Wendell Willkie was by and large a Democrat. He was a registered Democrat until 1939. But he has some differences of opinions. So here's an excerpt from an essay he did in Fortune magazine. "You have usurped our sovereign power by curtailing our Bill of Rights," it charged, "thereby placing into the hands of a few men in executive commissions all the powers requisite of tyranny. FDR had separated business from industry, from the ordinary lives of the people, and has applied against them a philosophy of hate and mistrust. Therefore, abandon this attitude of hate and set our enterprises free. We, the people, promised a New Deal devoid of class animus and faithful to the Great Depression reforms, a New Deal with its budgets balanced gradually and a bureaucratic waste and duplication eliminated." It's a pretty typical small business conservative Republican philosophy. And that's where Willkie really differed with Roosevelt, was how the government worked and what the government's philosophy about running should be. And that's a legitimate discussion to have. We should keep having that discussion. It's good to have those discussions about philosophical differences and what the purpose of government is. And people have different reactions to that based on where they're at in life sometimes. If you're very successful and you employ people, lots of people, you might chafe against business regulations. If you're poor, trying to find a job, you may want government help. It's that in-between places where the government gets too involved and gets too messed up that people have a real problem with. I always remember in 1981 when President Reagan got inaugurated, and in his speech, I believe it was, he said the 11 most feared words in any person's modern lexicon were, "Hello, I'm from the federal government and I'm here to help you." So that's an issue that we've always had. That's where Republicans and Democrats tend to differ and fight amongst themselves, is that philosophy of government. Roosevelt clearly wants bigger government. He thinks government can do things. That's how he won in 1932. It's not that Herbert Hoover was a bad guy. Herbert Hoover was a compassionate, smart, brilliant man. Helped rebuild Europe after World War I. But he thought that private industry and things like that could take care of the problems, not government. So Willkie had just a difference of opinion. He campaigned hard. I think he's the one candidate for president that Roosevelt actually feared, because he had this ability to draw in crowds, to get people excited. Like I said, he kind of has this whip-smart attitude about the law, combined with this down-home Indiana homespun cloth kind of attitude. And that makes him a real threat to Roosevelt in 1940. I think Roosevelt's a little nervous going into that last campaign. Roosevelt, at the same time, he was nervous about, he didn't really tell people what he's going to run or not. People went into the 1940 election going, is FDR in? Is he running for a third team? Oh my God, that's horrible. Let me show you a couple buttons I have from that campaign. I have a Wendell Willkie button. I gotta make sure I do this. Y'all see that? Ah, I'm doing it. I'm back. It's backwards. There we go. Then this is another one that's kind of fun. No third term. That was one of the biggest problems for Roosevelt. It wasn't necessarily the policies he was pushing forward, is that people didn't want him to have a third term. This isn't supposed to happen in this country. That's wrong. 2 terms. Even Washington himself, who could have had a third term easily, said, nope, 2 terms is enough. Kind of set the precedent. But I think there's enough people that look at the other candidates running for president on the Democratic side, particularly Jim Farley, and they can say, man, this guy's no FDR. And FDR at the end of the day said, this guy's no FDR. But he kind of kept that close. He didn't let people know. The campaign actually started and Jim Farley ran against him. And people went to the convention as delegates for Jim Farley. So Roosevelt kind of has a small revolution on his hands in his own party, but once that gets figured out and he's the nominee, he goes after Wendell Willkie. Willkie goes after him. I have in my collection a copy of Speeches. What is it called? An American Program by Wendell Willkie. This would have been a nice slender campaign volume from 1940, laying out his ideas. What I'm impressed at is he has 2 different chapters on race relations and fixing the race relations in this country. He's kind of the last Republican that kind of goes that way on this issue. They will tend to go back the other way after a while. They get more into states' rights, but Willkie doesn't necessarily think of that's the way to go. Wonderful book about Willkie came out a couple years ago, The Improbable Wendell Willkie. Nice, easy read. I spent most of my February vacation reading this one. When Willkie lost the election in 1940, rather than spend the rest of his time bad-mouthing the president who had beaten him, he actually helped Roosevelt out. He went to Europe a number of times on diplomatic missions to support Roosevelt's administration. He didn't necessarily find the internationalist part bad, even though he had to do that as the Republican nominee. He thought he could use his skills as a negotiator, as an attorney, to help out that stuff. And that, I think, is a great example of somebody who sits and looks at the campaign and can stew on it and be grumpy and mean and bitter the rest of their lives. Or they can say, you know what? The future of the country is more important. Getting us through the next couple of years is more important. My career is not as important. And that's what he did. He spent the last couple of years of his life off and on helping FDR out, meeting with FDR, talking to FDR. He died relatively young, but I think it would have been interesting if Willkie had won. It would have been, I don't know how much different he would have been. He would have changed the economic focus, but I think his internationalist focus, I think, would have been somewhat stable. Because no matter what FDR was doing to kind of keep things mellow, they couldn't see Pearl Harbor coming, and that changed everything. So, do you remember back in 2001, the biggest foreign policy crisis for President Bush was the North Korean and the plane? Remember that? There was a plane that the North Koreans had captured with Americans on it. That was the big diplomatic problem in the early parts, and then 9/11 happened, and it changed everything. So it's those issues you think you have figured out or not figured out can sometimes be usurped by something bigger and more powerful and more destructive. So that's Wendell Willkie. Another person that Roosevelt had a hard time with after a while, I think I sent you guys the link to this article when we got started, was Al Smith. Al Smith was a Tammany Hall politician, right? You can tell by this picture. Look, he's wearing that's your stereotypical Irish Paul. He's wearing a bowler. Brilliant, smart, compassionate, a man of the people if ever there was one. But he's one of those guys that's old school. The country's changing. How things operate is changing. How campaigns are run are changing. He meets FDR in the legislature when FDR first goes there in 1910. They can be allies. There's a difference between having allies and friends in politics, right? You don't. Someone once said there's no such thing as friends in politics. You have allies, and the allies will help you conspire to get in, get the diamonds, and get out. But they're not your friends. If they get caught, they're going to turn on you really fast. But you have to know when their alliances are working and when they're not. It's like watching governors today working with President Trump. Andrew Cuomo and Gavin Newsom have found ways to work with the administration to get what they need for their states by finding ways to kind of acquiesce and give in and not give up their core value system. They know how to play the game. So they know that if they want things for their state, they have to somewhat be allies of President Trump, at least for a short period of time, to get what they need out of the administration. And that's true at any administration. There are governors from both sides who have worked with opposition parties in the White House to get what they need. And those governors tend to get reelected and stay in power. So Al Smith worked with FDR, but Al Smith was, like I said, old school. In 1924, he gave FDR his chance to get back on his feet, so to speak, by having him nominate Al Smith at the convention. At that convention, FDR came out on crutches. Not quite what he wanted, the image yet. So in 1928, the Democrats had their convention in Houston. I don't know what the hell they were doing having a convention in July in 1928 in Houston, because that building had no air conditioning. I don't know how they handled that, but they did somehow. But Smith had asked Roosevelt to give the nomination speech. Some of the folks around around Smith were worried that Smith was raising up a monster. In the movie Warm Springs, the Al Smith character says, don't worry about it. He'll be dead in a year. They didn't think this was going to happen for FDR. They're taking pity on him. Bad idea. Big mistake. That was the convention when FDR came out walking with a cane and on his son's arm with that walk that he was able to figure out. So then Smith says, well, what the heck? Let's get him to get out of here. Let's get him to be governor of New York. I can run New York when I'm president. Even though I don't get elected president, I can run New York. I can keep my hands involved. This is a bad idea. This is like Lyndon Johnson, who's a brilliant, brilliant Senate politician, thinking he could run the Senate when he's vice president. Didn't work. So once FDR gets elected governor in 1928, Smith thinks he can help really run things in New York, and he's quickly disabused of that notion by FDR. FDR brings in his own staff, starts his own program development, starts doing things the way he wants to do. This irritates Smith, and it develops more and more and more. It was very clear that FDR has nothing to do with Smith on that level, to the point that in 1940, Al Smith disliked FDR so much, he campaigned for Wendell Willkie. That's not unlike in 2000, 2008 when Joe Lieberman campaigned for John McCain. People forget that Joe Lieberman was the Democratic vice presidential candidate in 2000. So sometimes politicians will do things to get their message across, even if it means going against the grain and going against those who they had alliances with in the same party from just a few years before. So within a few years after Roosevelt became president, Smith and he no longer agreed. Smith and he actually were opposed to each other. And like I said, Smith actually campaigned for Wendell Willkie in 1940. That's pretty crazy. That's just the political side of things that FDR has to deal with. Al Smith of his own party, Wendell Willkie is an example of the Republican Party. There are countless members of Congress, senators and congressmen and bureaucrats who were opposed to Roosevelt politically. But amazingly enough, I think some of it, one other person, before I forget, I almost forgot. Politically, I think this is one of the other big threats to him. Remember Huey Long? The Kingfish down in Louisiana. Talk about LSU. A bunch of kids from LSU got drafted last night. That's Huey Long's school. He built that school from the ground up. That's his legacy. Huey Long, how many of you have seen the movie For All the King's Men or read the book? Yeah, Mike said yes. The Crockers, anybody else over here? Great book, great movie. Robert Penn Warren wrote it, and it's a fictionalized account of Huey Long. I can't remember the name of the guy who did the version in the 30s, but in the early 2000s, they did a version with Sean Penn. And it shows you how powerful people with a voice can become when you find a way to take the people who have been left out of society, the oppressed, the downtrodden, the forgotten. If you have a person with the right pitch, the right anger, they can really reach out and grab people by the emotional core and bring them along. Huey Long was one of these guys. This guy could talk himself literally into anything. He talked himself into law school. He talked himself to advance a grade. And when he's an elementary school kid, he was able to talk to the principal and let him go to the next grade. He didn't have the records for it. He just talked himself into it. So, okay, sure, you're in. Go to 8th grade. Talked himself into law school. Talked himself into get married. He was that gifted as a speaker. I don't know if it's like you get caught up like, oh, this guy's amazing, or I wish this guy would shut up. I want to just like get rid of him. So I'll just think, okay, go do this and kick him off to the next room. But he's able to find a method to harness the anger and the frustration that people have when they feel society is leaving them behind, when they feel like they've been forgotten. And not unlike 2016, you can see parallels between Huey Long and President Trump. People in 2016 were scared. The economy was changing. These people that work in the factories and the coal mines, what are they supposed to do if you shut those things down and you start moving to a different kind of economy? You harness that fear and you can get it to take yourself to a place you didn't think you could go before. Huey Long's an example of that. His oratorical ability, his willingness to cast aspersions on people, to find a scapegoat for all the problems that people have, and to speak directly to the fears and the things they need. You want a school? I'm the one that can build you the school. You need jobs? I'll bring you jobs. It's not your fault you're poor. It's their fault you're poor. Those folks are doing it. You have to blame everyone else for that stuff. He starts out as a big admirer of FDR, but after a while he decides FDR isn't going fast enough. Huey Long actually has a program he develops called Every Man a King. There's a song, the Share Your Wealth program. Socialism, pure and simple. Government provide. He has a song. He writes a song that goes along with it called Every Man a King. If you want to watch something kind of funny, watch Huey Long. You can go on YouTube and find him singing Every Man a King. He wrote the LSU fight song, so why not? Just a guy, I can't imagine how successful he would have been had he been in our world with all the technology we have here today. He would have had a web page and he would have had a Twitter account. I can't imagine what his Twitter account would have been like. Would have been crazy. But he becomes a politician. He gets elected governor in Louisiana very young. He gets elected senator in Louisiana. He finds a way to make sure he can start serving as a senator while he's still the governor of Louisiana. He knows all the machinations. He knows how to threaten people. He serves both jobs. The governor that follows him is a Huey Long sycophant. He remakes Louisiana. Louisiana is Huey Long. He sets up his brother Earl later becomes governor. His son becomes a senator in Louisiana, Russell Long. for a long time. It's crazy how involved, you talk about the Kennedys in Massachusetts, the dynasty that they have, that they still have to some extent, or the Mondales. I remember in Minnesota back in 1998, there was a race for governor in the Democratic primary, and it was called the My Three Sons race, because you had Walter Mondale's son Ted, Hubert Humphrey's son Skip, and Orville Freeman's son Mike, all running for governor at the same time. My three sons. You know, we say we don't like dynasties in this country. We got rid of them in the Revolution. Well, we find it hard to let them go, I think, at times. We kind of enjoy that making royal families of the homespun folks in this country. And the Longs are no different. They make Louisiana what it is, good and bad. But Huey Long has a lot of power. When he comes out against Roosevelt, he's seen as a threat. His ability, his reach is far beyond what any senator should have, far beyond what any senator is capable of doing for the most part. But it's his skill, it's his power control that helps him grow and grow and grow and grow and grow in power. In 1935, he's seen by FDR as a possible threat for president. He could run against FDR in the primaries and probably do some serious damage. But unfortunately for him, he's assassinated in the state capitol in 1935. The man who was accused of killing him was a doctor who felt his family had been wronged by Long, and he came up and just shot him. Long survived a couple of days, but it was a huge calamity. But it took some of that anger and frustration of the public discourse out of the picture, because you no longer had Huey Long. Other people tried to step up into his shoes. His brother was governor. There's a great movie with Paul Newman played Earl Long, because Earl Long was known primarily for his relationship with a famous stripper at the time. Never quite. It's you know, the sons and daughters of these famous people we raise up have a hard time because they so often have to pretend to be something they're not. You know, there's a fascinating book I read about the children of the Civil Rights Movement. And what is it like to be Martin Luther King's kid, or Stokely Carmichael's kid, or Governor Patterson's kid, or George Wallace's kid? How do you handle the pressure? Well, you're Dr. King's kid. Why aren't you Dr. King? Well, part of the reason was they're not Dr. King. They never saw their father. He was never home. He was never there. He was a great dad, but he was busy all the time. And nobody really is their parent in a good and a bad way. Ted Williams' kid, John Henry Williams, everybody thought, oh, he's going to be the next Ted Williams. That guy couldn't hit a basketball if you threw it at him. Just wasn't there. And that's okay. Well, he put pressure on, so the Longs have dealt with that too. Russell Long was a senator from Louisiana for years, and never quite the thing. He was a good senator, and he took care of his state, but never quite the person his father was. But Ken Burns, and not the Ken Burns who was on the call the other day, but the other Ken Burns, did a short documentary about Huey Long you can find online, I think. I wouldn't recommend reading T. Harry Williams' book because it is over 1,000 pages. Well done. But you can see echoes of guys like this in our politics today still. So those are the big political people that Roosevelt had to deal with. Direct threats to his electability, direct threats to the electoral process. You could get rid of him by campaigning and running good campaigns and outfoxing him. But I think in some ways it's the people outside politics that are more of a threat than the people in the electoral process. And I'll talk about those three guys for the next few minutes because I think they're fascinating. One of them has a political connection, but it's more outside that. It's financial and diplomatic, and that's Joe Kennedy, Jack's dad. This is you've all heard of Michael Beschloss? He's on MSNBC. He's a famous presidential historian. He's almost as well known as Doris Kearns Goodwin. If you see him, he's always got a suit on with a light blue tie and slick back hair. Brilliant guy. He's written fantastic books. This is his first book, which is actually doctoral dissertation. And I had to meet him at an event, and he signed it for me, which is very nice. But Joe Kennedy comes from initially poor Irish stock that came over in the aftermath of the potato famine. His father was a saloon owner, involved in politics. Joe went to the right schools, went to Harvard. Thought making money was the best way to get rid of all the negative attitudes about Irish Catholics in the country. He'd show them. And he gets involved in business. He gets married. He has kids. During the war, he is the general manager of the shipyards in Quincy, Mass. So he knows who Roosevelt is because their paths cross a little bit when they're young. But he goes off. He gets out of banking, goes into movie making, and making money. But in 1932, he's taking a turn and wanting to get more involved in a I wouldn't say politics per se at that point, but kind of getting involved with where the power is. Some people just attracted to power. And so he gives a lot of money to the Roosevelt campaign. And he's believed to being able to help the Governor Roosevelt's campaign, like helping with him with Irish Catholics. So here is a picture of Roosevelt's train. See, FDR is right there. And right below him, with the no hair and the big round glasses, is Joe Kennedy. He put a lot of money into that campaign. He knew people in influential places. He could help swing votes to Roosevelt. And it certainly had an impact. And when you help, and you can see that you help get a president elected, you just walk away and go, oh, that was fun. You want something out of that. There's something you want out of that. He wanted to be Secretary of the Treasury. That ain't going to happen. That's too big a position. So Roosevelt made him the first chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission, the first guy in charge of watching Wall Street. Now, we all know that Joe Kennedy made a lot of money on Wall Street back in the day, sold short and everything else, all the stuff now that you can't supposedly do, Joe Kennedy did. And FDR, someone said, well, you can't put a guy like that in charge of the Wall Street folks, Mr. President. And FDR said, who better to watch the hens than the fox? You know, just let them, he knows all the tricks. He'll stop the other bad guys because he's done it all himself. That's his first gig. He's a little disappointed in that. He wants a little bit more. But what Kennedy also does is one of his good friends or alliances is with James Roosevelt, the president's son. Now, I got to tell you, one of those weird things the other day. This is kind of funny. I'll be right back. Hey, don't fan. I was in the at St. Michael's Parish. They have a lending library downstairs. And I called up there today because it said it was still open. And I said, well, is that open? And the secretary there is a friend of mine. Said, well, it is for you. So come on down. I put on a mask and gloves and went down. There's no one in there. I wiped down. But in amongst the church books I found a book called My Parents, A Differing View by James Roosevelt. And I'm pretty sure this is something that belonged to Frank Morin back in the day because that's the kind of stuff he would have read. But James Roosevelt was involved and knew people in the administration, obviously. He worked in the White House a little bit. And so he worked with Joe Kennedy to stock up stores of Haig and Haig Scotch all over the country. You know, the idea that Joe Kennedy was a bootlegger, they've pretty much proven it's not true. He didn't actually actively run booze, but he stored it up. And because of his friendship with James Roosevelt, when they undid Prohibition, he was in a place to flood the market with his booze, his stock, and make money. So the old man did stuff, he did stuff on the line illegally, but they'd never been able to prove anything really illegal. He knew where the line was and got right up to it and then backed up. That's pretty shrewd business practices to be friends with the son of the president who can say, hey, next week, Prohibition might be ending. And you can flood the market with your booze. That's good thinking. So that's what Joe did. But he still wants to have a bigger job. He still wants to, more of a reward for what he'd done in 1932. And he helped again in 1936. At that point, FDR says, okay, well, let's do some stuff. And FDR liked nothing better than to kind of dangle things in front of folks and kind of make them squirm a little bit. And so he invited Joe to the White House. That's a pretty big deal, get invited to the White House for dinner. So they go to the White House, they have a nice dinner. Then FDR calls Joe into his office. He says, well, I'd like to appoint you to be the ambassador of the court of St. James. Make you the ambassador to England. But, Joe, there's a problem. And Kennedy's, what's the problem? He said, well, the problem is that I know and you know and we all know that you have horribly bowed legs. And part of the process is you have to wear, breeches, colonial breeches, to present yourself to the king. And they're not going to let you walk down that path of Buckingham Palace in your bow-legged breeches. That's just not going to happen. So don't worry about it. Sorry to even bother. And Kennedy said, no. If I can get a dispensation from that, can I be the ambassador? Like, well, okay. So give me 2 weeks. 2 weeks later, Joe Kennedy shows up and says to FDR, I got the court officials in England to rule that I can wear long trousers to my being presented at court and presenting my credentials. It's the first time anybody's able to do that. And Joe Kennedy got it because he really wanted that job to be ambassador. So he outfoxed FDR. Was appointed. But can you imagine? Part of that story goes that they were in the Oval Office, and FDR said, well, I'm going to make sure you have bow legs. You drop your pants. And Joe Kennedy did. He dropped his trousers to show the president, yeah, his legs were bow-legged. And I just don't see presidents doing that very often. That's kind of a humiliating thing for Joe Kennedy, too. But when he got to England, he said to Rose Kennedy, his wife, he said, just think of it, Rose. For years, we've been the ones with our noses pressed up against the window. And now we've been invited to the party. It was a big thing for him as an Irish Catholic, one generation removed from being a new immigrant in this country. He's now the ambassador to England, the arch enemy of the Irish Catholics, both in Ireland and the United States. And there he is. He's come full circle. When the Kennedys arrive in England, they bring all their kids. There's tons of news footage of Jack and Rosemary and Eunice. There's a great video of Bobby. He's, I think, 10 years old. And they say, how are you doing, sir? I'm so excited. He says, I didn't even sleep last night. He was so excited to go to England. And the British press ate it up. The older kids went to debutante balls and society events. Younger kids went to the zoo. But behind all that happiness and joy and beauty of a family are the war clouds are gathering. And Joe Kennedy knows his boys in particular are the right age to go off to war. He does not want that to happen. He knows what can happen, what war can do. And so he begins to get quietly kind of saying, I don't know, this is the best thing. I don't know. His public pronouncements become more and more common against the war. You can't do that. You're an ambassador. You are not the ambassador of Kennedy to England. You're the president's ambassador to England. It's what you say represents what the president believes. You can't be doing different things than that. That doesn't stop Joe Kennedy. He says what he believes. He actually once talks to a reporter off the record. And one of the things he says is, democracy in England is done. That's not what you want to hear from the American ambassador when the tension's really getting so intense that you can't even see straight. You want the Americans to be backing you up, not saying you're done, you're finished. If Hitler comes, he's pretty much going to wipe the plate with you guys. So his attitude gets him in a lot of trouble, and he gets recalled. Roosevelt finally can't handle it. Roosevelt's already started going around him, dealing with Churchill on his own. And he finally brings Joe home in 1940. But he's worried that Joe will campaign against him. He's panicked that Joe Kennedy will become an enemy like Al Smith is, that he will start really actively campaigning against him. He's lucky because Joe Kennedy does not do that. Joe Kennedy finds a way to swallow his pride. He gives a great radio address on behalf of FDR. And when the war does come, he's still opposed to the war. And he suffers an incredible personal loss because of the war. His oldest son, Joe, was killed in a plane accident over the coast of England. Jack, as we know, goes off to the South Pacific and becomes a war hero, almost dies. His daughter, Kathleen's husband, she marries an English Protestant, not just an English Protestant, but a member of the aristocracy in England. He dies a month after they got married. Just 1 month. Horrible. So Joe knows what war does. It destroys. It never builds up. It destroys. And for him, what it destroys is his family, his hopes and dreams. And he remains embittered to Roosevelt the rest of his life. They don't speak. They don't talk. They don't communicate at all. When Jack runs for Congress, he's like, stay away from Roosevelt. Well, Jack is president when his first, not a State of the Union address, but his first address to Congress he notices that they are doing it on Roosevelt's birthday. And supposedly the ambassador, Kennedy, was very angry. Why'd you bring up that guy's name? He just hated him because he took away his family, took away his core, what he believed in was gone. So, ironically, also in 1960, when Jack ran for president in the primaries in West Virginia, one of the pictures that is almost every house in West Virginia, every shack, every house across the state of West Virginia, there's a picture of FDR because he was the hero to those folks. He was the guy who really brought hope and a belief that things could happen to the people of West Virginia. And so Jack gets FDR Jr., who's a congressman from New York, to come campaign for him. FDR Jr. is a good-looking, strapping guy, looks like his dad, reminds people of his father. And at one point in this campaign, he says, you know what, Jack's daddy and my daddy were just like this. That's a bold-faced lie, but it worked. People say, well, I don't care about this Catholic thing then. If FDR and his dad, if he's associated with FDR, that's awesome. We don't need to worry about anything else. So another alliance that comes together. The old men, the dads couldn't talk to each other, hate each other after a while. But the sons could come together to form alliances to get things done, particularly help Jack win the West Virginia primary. That Roosevelt name was still so powerful in West Virginia, and Jack knew it. And he got Franklin to help him out. Two of the people I think that really, really, really put a burr under FDR's saddle were not politicians. One of them was Father Coughlin. Anybody remember a story of Father Coughlin? He was a Catholic priest, born and raised in Canada, but came to America. Let me find out a bit about him. I think he's actually a fascinating guy. I'll play an excerpt of him in a minute. But he comes to the States. He gets a job, goes to seminary. For a while, he's just an ordinary pastor in a small church in Michigan. But he found out he had a gift. He could really move people in his homilies. He could, once you kind of get a reputation for being a good homilist, that's the one thing about church that I love is not every priest has the same gifts for speaking. And so it's something else you have to be going to church for, not to hear the priest speak, because sometimes they're exciting, sometimes they're boring. Coughlin was not boring. He was very similar to Huey Long in the sense he could rile people up. He could get them focused on things. And when he stayed, I think, focused on church things, it was great. He could stay, move people to do things, to be more involved in their community and in the church with his gift of oratory. And then they gave him a little radio show. Make it a little better. We get the word out to a few more people around town. Put him on a little radio station. Well, if you're good, what happens? More and more people hear you. It grows and grows. It's like Crocker, you know? He's just the version now of like taking this Tales from West God, and it's going to be a national thing, I predict. But Gary's not a bad guy, so he's not a danger to any of us. But Coughlin gets more and more. He starts to preach a gospel of government help for people, that we need to look out for our neighbors. He supports Roosevelt at first, like Kennedy did, like Huey Long did. But at some point, he starts to veer off that path. He figures Roosevelt isn't doing enough, or doing too much in one way and not enough in this other way. And unfortunately, as part of his attacks on FDR, he goes off on an anti-Semitic tirade. Now, the church has had a problem for a long time. Every church has, with how do you relate to the people of the Jewish faith. There's been a real problem, particularly in Europe. And it's kind of translated over the United States. The anti-Semitic attitude is here. It's sometimes just underneath the surface. Unfortunately, in Coughlin's case, it comes out, and it begins to be part of his homilies, his speeches. He starts to see plots everywhere he looks. When he talks about the banking system, he's not talking about the bankers per se, he's talking about the Jews in his mind are running the banking system. Let me play you a clip of a Father Coughlin speech. You'll see how powerful an orator he was.
There is written in the Constitution of the United States that Congress has the right to coin, issue, and regulate the value of money. That's good Americanism, and it's good enough for me. Every politician today in the Democratic or Republican ranks who sits upon one of the thrones of the mighty doesn't believe in that part of the Constitution. They don't want to believe in that part of the Constitution. They believe that the Federal Reserve Bank has the right to coin and regulate the value of money. They're not even Americans, these so-called Democrats and Republicans. And so, Mr. Roosevelt, who was very loquacious in 1933 about driving the money changers out of the temple, is now bent upon another policy. I think driving the workmen out of decent annual wages. I come before you today.
That's pretty strong language from a priest. And that guy had a huge platform from which to speak. Now you can hear that. They're not even American, he says. Heard that before. Money changers. Who's he talking about? We know. It's code words. It's just, it's the same old claptrap we've heard again and again and again in our country. But Coughlin's scary because he has this huge platform from which to address things. He really starts, about 1935, 1936 is when he really starts getting more of an isolationist attitude. An anti-Semitic attitude really starts to come, a nationalist attitude. He has a small magazine that he publishes too. In one issue, they published the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Has anyone ever heard of that? Anyone? Joan Farnsworth is asleep. Gary. Yeah, unmute. You've heard of it? Do you know what it is?
No, I've heard of it. I'm not into the details.
It's a conspiracy book, right? It's the book that lays out the grand plan, apparently, of how the Jews are going to overtake the world. And it's been debunked and debunked and debunked and debunked. And it's just it got written and put out there. It's like anything else where people go against people they don't like, whether it's the Masons or the Knights of Columbus or any group like that that kind of stands up and kind of says, hey, you know, we're trying to make things better. Well, you're part of a secret society. You're part of a secret group. And he pushed this in his book, his magazine. And that, at the end of the day, was too much for folks. They'd had enough. So he crossed the line with business who ran his radio programs. Like, you can't put that stuff in your stuff there, Father Coughlin. That's not right. So he ran up against the almighty leveler of how things get put out in this country, which is economics and money. And they started getting complaints. We know what he's saying. We can't do that. And so radio stations started pulling his show. And because he overstepped his bounds and went over the top with his anti-Semitic stuff, I wish someone had written a more recent book about him. I find him fascinating, and I find his rhetoric fascinating because you hear that today in some cases too. But he went one step too far when he put that into his magazine. They started cutting him back on his radio time. And before long, he was back to just being a parish priest back in Michigan. But for a bit of time in there, and when he spoke, it wasn't just from his rectory. It wasn't just in his church. He had rallies across the country where thousands and thousands of people showed up to listen to him talk. And you get that, and you get Huey Long, and you get the German-American Bund, which is out there at the same time, not taken very seriously, but actually pretty effective. And you get Charles Lindbergh, who's the last person I want to talk about today, out there talking. You've got a combustible mix that really could start a fire in this country. Thank God they all kind of went on their own ways and never came together. If you had a committee of those people, who knows what would happen. And it's that constant battle we have, right, in this country of, is there a limit on what people can say? As Steve Martin said, is it okay to yell movie in a crowded firehouse? How do you handle that? Do you suppress the freedom of speech in the interest of national unity? That's been done periodically around the world, not with good effect. So Roosevelt has kind of walk a line of like, okay, the guy's nuts, but let him talk. I can't like shut him down. But at the same time, I think the general idea is if you let them talk enough, they'll hang themselves. I think that's what happened. They talked so much and got so out of control, they ended their own careers. And maybe FDR knew that was coming, but it had to be a very difficult time for him to sit and listen to these guys just harangue and berate him and say the things they did and let that kind of get into the blood system. You may do that now. People say things that gets in the political blood system, and they go, I didn't mean that, and they take it back. Well, that's what you do. You put it in the system. So the stories and on either side of the aisle that kind of get out there and the conspiracy theories, that's what these guys are pushing. They didn't have as big a media platform as they did back then. If you didn't have radio, you weren't going to hear Coughlin. If you didn't subscribe to his magazine, you weren't going to hear him. But you might hear Huey Long somewhere else. And so a lot of these similar strands of philosophy are floating around. Had to be very nerve-wracking. And then you take those guys. You take Coughlin and Long, and you toss in the greatest living hero in America at the time. And he has the same attitude. Wow. That's just got to be frightening. You know what I'm talking about? Who am I talking about? Anybody know what I'm talking about?
Lindbergh.
Lindbergh. Charles A. Lindbergh. An amazing guy. An absolutely fascinating, amazing individual. As a Minnesotan, we take great pride in the fact he was born in Minnesota. That's where he learned to fly his plane. His father was in the Congress from Minnesota. What he did crossing the Atlantic was huge. My dad taught us as a kid, there's a song, Lucky Lindy, that my dad would sing on the ukulele. That's how I got to know Lindbergh was. An amazing story. And then in the middle of all that, he's become so famous. He's really America's first celebrity of any stature like that. And what happens to them in the 1930s? Their baby gets kidnapped. Remember that? Lindbergh baby. Oh. And you toss in anti-German mix in that story because there's evidence that Bruno Richard Hauptmann was involved and just all sorts of weird whispered stories. But in the 1930s, as they go on, he's like, it'd be like having, I don't know who'd be like today, who's a celebrity. The difference is there are celebrities today who have done nothing, but they're celebrities. And there's celebrities like Charles Lindbergh, who actually was a brilliant guy who had done something with himself. But he has gone to Germany. He's visited with Goering. He's been given a tour of the Luftwaffe factories. They've given him an award. And he kind of like, wow, these guys are way too prepared. We can't do anything. We're just going to get outsmarted again. But then there's this anti-Semitic strand in his philosophy too. And it comes down, and he sounds a lot like Father Coughlin. He sounds a lot like some other people. But he has a bigger platform than either one of those guys has. And to have this hero, how do you combat a guy like that? This American hero, how do you let him walk around and say things he does and not get too much in his grill because you understand what celebrity he has? You can't attack him too much. Roosevelt does the same thing. But Lindbergh's very effective because he has a much bigger platform. He wants us to stay out of the war. He uses code words for who's causing all this trouble. I think, in my sense, he's the guy that scares Roosevelt the most because he has such a big platform from which to speak. And he's saying the same thing some of the other people are saying. It had to be an amazing time to have been paying attention back then. Gary?
Yeah, just a quick comment. Netflix is running a series right now called The Plot Against America, where it reverses history, and he actually manages to get elected president instead over Roosevelt. So and that whole anti-Semitic thing is the primary storyline. So it's interesting. It's on Netflix if people want to catch it.
Well, and there's I need to put this in my look. There's a great book by Lynn Olson called Those Angry Days. It's about this exact thing and how these two men really personified the difference of opinion and what was happening, where we were headed. The sad thing for Lindbergh, I think people listen to him a little bit more if he had been more just on a philosophical basis. I don't want to go to war. I don't think we can beat these guys. A lot of people are going to die if we do this. but he's this anti-Semitic streak in him starts to drive his argument, and that's just so unfortunate because it's wrong and it's sickening, and I think in the end it poisons the attitude people have towards him. He's like, oh, what the okay. After Pearl Harbor, he doesn't really have an effective platform on which to stand anymore. And once
Mike, it's wrong and it's sickening, but boy, we're lucky he did it, because otherwise he could have won that election.
He could have run, yep.
And kept us out of the war, or tried to. Yep. And what would Europe look like now? What would we look like?
We wouldn't be having this class.
No.
So, and Lynn Olson is one of the better historians of this time period. Her book on the kind of the diplomatic corps in Washington called Citizens of London, but all those folks who were in London at the time, and all the interpersonal relationships that are involved, whether it's E.H. Harriman, Ambassador Winnett, who replaced Joe Kennedy, and not their relationships between them, but their relationships between, example, both of those gentlemen and some others had affairs with Pamela Churchill, who's Randolph Churchill's wife. And so there's this little conduit between diplomats and the Prime Minister of England through his daughter-in-law. We don't talk a lot about that. It would make a great miniseries.
Yeah.
But that's not unlike in India. And after the war was over and Mountbatten went to India as the last viceroy, and his wife fell head over heels in love with Nehru. And Mountbatten knew it. But it worked to Mountbatten's advantage because he has this conduit between what he wants to do as viceroy and what the Indian people are willing to do, because he knows his wife knows Nehru. So there are these interesting aspects of diplomatic relations that have nothing to do with diplomacy. They have to do with sex. Unfortunately, those become miniseries and really horrible television rather than really good books. But you look at Lynn Olson's book, and she talks a lot about that stuff. There's this component we haven't written much about. Relationships are not just diplomatic relationships; they're personal relationships. Now, I will give Lindbergh credit for one thing. When the United States goes to war, when he sees his cause is lost, he puts down his microphone, suits back up in the military, and helps work and design aircraft ideas for the United States Air Force. So he does like Wendell Willkie does. When he's beat, he knows he's beat, and he goes back to help save the country he loves, and he's involved in that sort of stuff. And his reputation recovers. People tend to forget stuff. If you live long enough, people tend to forget things. So in 1969, when the Apollo 11 crew goes to the moon, one of the last phone calls they get is from Charles Lindbergh. He's still a hero to them. He's well known as an environmental guru. His focus on getting things done to save the planet are still talked about today. His wife, Anne Lindbergh, is well known today as an essayist. And we always remember his flight across the Atlantic, but we don't necessarily remember his anti-Semitic tirades as an isolationist before the war. We tend to be pretty forgiving in this country if you do something good once you've done something stupid. But sometimes it's just whether or not who lives longer, right? He outlived all his critics. I mean, it's like here in Maine, we worship the ground that Joshua Chamberlain walked on. He was a great guy. There are other great guys from Maine who did just as much, if not more than him. He outlived most of them, you know? So history is kind to people if I think if you tend to see some positive things that they've done in society, they tend to let you be forgiven for the bad stuff you do. And Lindbergh isn't primarily really remembered for his isolationist stuff. He's remembered for the crossing the Atlantic and his contribution to flight. And no one's perfect. No one's perfect. Everyone has foibles and mistakes. When we pick and choose, I guess, people we like, and we idolize them or follow them, even though they have imperfections. And that's the beauty of history. And we're always finding out new stuff. One of the things they found out about Lindbergh a few years ago, a guy named Scott Berg wrote a wonderful biography of Lindbergh. And I think it was he and some other people found out Lindbergh had a hold of their family in Germany. He went to Germany off and on after the war. He had a hold of the family. It was like Charles Kuralt. Remember Charles Kuralt? Yeah. He had a whole other family in Montana. It's not a girlfriend, but a whole wife and kids. Lindbergh had a family in Germany no one knew about. So this paragon of family values and virtue had some foibles in his life. So, as did FDR. Not perfect. A human being, but found a way somehow to pick himself up every day and move on when things threaten to take him down. I think I'll give Lindbergh credit. In some sense, he's a horrible person. But when he was beat, and he got back in to help his country out and move forward. Something to be said about people like that. So, there are lots of other enemies of FDR's. There's the press doesn't like him very much in some parts of the country. Eleanor gets a lot of people angry at her for things like asking Marian Anderson to sing. She quits they're going to have that big rally in Washington with the DAR, but they're not going to let Marian Anderson sing because she's black, and Eleanor quits the DAR and has her sing at the White House instead, Constitution Hall. So she finds ways to step around, but people don't like that. Who are you to have a black woman singing? Oh, you're horrible. A lot of people in the military don't like her when she goes overseas during the war because she interrupts logistics and things like that because she has to come in and inspect the troops. And some general admiral's ticked off because, well, I can't bring my boats in today because the battleship's coming in with Mrs. Roosevelt. Blah, 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 blah. She's seen as furthering his advances, so people don't like her because she's married to Franklin. I think she's inoculated somewhat because of that stuff, because she's a woman. But there is a bit of real rancor and frustration against her too. But there is kind of a, I don't know what you call it, kind of an unspoken rule that we won't attack her too much because she's a lady. There's General Custer died in 1876. His widow survived until 1933. Over 50 years. There was not one negative word written or much less said about him in public for over 50 years until she died. They wouldn't dare. You can't attack a woman. And they also knew she was tougher than most of them. The first anti-Custer book came out within a month after she passed away. Clearly, it had been written, was waiting to be put out there. But they wouldn't do it. And so I think there's kind of this unstated rule in the press. You don't pick on the first lady. You don't give her a hard time. Boy, have things changed now. Things are different. And she's the most active. I mean, I can see, why would you attack, Laura Bush or Michelle Obama if you were just doing more traditional stuff? But Eleanor Roosevelt was much more proactive as first lady than any of the rest of them have ever been. She had every right to be attacked in some people's minds. And they attacked her, but it wasn't, I don't think in some cases as loud as it was for Franklin, because he's the president. That helps inoculate her. And she's so charming. I mean, there's a story about how they couldn't believe she was going to fly into the South Pacific, interrupt the supply mission or whatever, and you had to disrupt everything. And then the admirals would meet her like, wow, she's awesome. Once they met her, like, whatever you got to do. Go ahead and do what you got to do, Mrs. Roosevelt. We love you. You're fantastic. So anytime you get involved in politics at that level, you're going to have enemies. Sometimes they're former allies of yours. I think he expected that from some people. He probably knew Joe Kennedy enough to know that if he pushed one too many buttons, Joe would turn on him. He's probably ready for it. Clearly he was, to remove him from office at the time. Franklin could turn a deaf ear on things he didn't want to hear about. But I find it amazing that those 30s, while Franklin's trying to get the country back up running, that I think had those three disparate elements come together, Coughlin, Lindbergh, and Long, they could have been a real problem for him. But then again, that's the problem in politics, right? How many people ran for president on the Democratic side this year? What, 25?
Right.
Those should have run for president. 4? But the rest of the people like, oh, they had a press person say, hey, Senator, you can be the president. And I'll find a consultant. We'll pay him $50,000 to make a poll that'll tell you to be president. They're not ready to be president. So serious people need to step up in those situations. And how do you balance? And I think we've talked about this before. How do you balance letting people say what they want to say, have the freedom of speech to say what they want to say, and yet that delicate line of like pointing out where they're wrong, not mocking them too much? You can do it with humor, which Roosevelt did again and again and again. In 1944, in the last campaign, one of like 2 or 3 campaign appearances he made, he talked about how Republican fiction writers had made up a story that he had sent a destroyer back to get his little dog Falla from a vacation spot. And he said, I don't resent the attacks. My wife doesn't resent the attacks, but Falla does resent them. And everybody they lost it. It was really funny. Yes, Joan.
Remember the time that Eleanor Roosevelt came to Portland and they wouldn't let the dog in the hotel that she was going to?
Yeah.
So she didn't stay there.
Yeah. It was actually her dog. FDR kind of purloined it. But so there's an example of using humor in politics to kind of lighten the load and take the sting out of stuff. Good politicians can do that. Remember, there's a clip of JFK at a press conference, and a female reporter asked him, "What have you done for women in this country?" And by her tone, Kennedy picked up and he said, "Well, obviously not enough." And they laughed. Jimmy Carter talked about when you get a big problem, he said, "Well, I told my mother I was going to run for president." And she said, "President of what?" And people laughed. And it took all that anger and frustration out. Roosevelt was a master of that stuff. He'd throw his head back and smile that smile with his cigarette and just make jokes about stuff. And all the anger goes out of the room. If you're good at it, you're good. I don't see Coughlin doing that. I don't see Huey Long doing that. I don't see Lindbergh doing that. So it's a great gift to have in politics, to walk that line, letting people say their piece, even if they're a danger to the country, you think, and using humor sometimes to kind of get through some stuff that's out there. Any questions? Everybody awake?
No.
Lost a couple of you. That's fine. That happens.
Yeah, I think I will leave, Mike.
Okay.
Yeah.
See ya.
Yep. Nice chat. Yeah.
Yep. See you Wednesday night. It's that special talk. So.
Okie dokes.
All right. So, I think in some ways there are 3 things that Roosevelt has to deal with as president that can threaten a lesser person. I think would not done very good with. 1 is the Depression. 2 is the war. But 3, in some ways, it's more difficult, is the time between the war and the start of the Depression. Just when you're trying to get things done and people constantly in your back of your head hammering on you, and they're very good at what they do, and they're very eloquent, and they can really make things tough for you. I think is the true, in my mind, the true beauty of Roosevelt's leadership and his ability to stay focused and not let the nattering nabobs and negativism, as Spiro Agnew would have called them, bother you too much. He found a way to let that stuff, just let it go and stay focused. I don't know how he did it. The man has the patience of a saint, in my book. Any questions about today?
No, I still hold Roosevelt in that upper echelon of, I say, the top 3 presidents we've ever had.
Yeah, easy. Lincoln, Washington, and Roosevelt.
That's my 3.
Yeah, one started us, one brought us back together, one healed us when we needed to be healed. So, and that I'll send you that article that my professor sent me about. Every 70 or 80 years, we come to this point where we just kind of go, and we need the leader to get us back on track, and the next generation is going to do that. I mean, look at you look at all the young people that ran the country after Washington stepped aside. I mean, when Alexander Hamilton was murdered in 1804, he was only in his 40s. That's how young he was when he got started. Lincoln was only 56 when he died. And in Congress after him came black senators and congressmen because of Reconstruction. There were young people getting involved. When Roosevelt died, he was only 63. He wasn't old. But look who came into power in the years after that. You could not have got elected to Congress, not have got elected dog catcher after World War II if you weren't a World War II veteran.
Right.
And every couple of years, there's smaller revolts. But I think there's some real sense out there. I have to read the article again that we're in the middle of one of these moments again. it's okay. Things will be better because we're going to regroup, refocus, and make this a better, more inclusive country than we've had it before. And that's kind of where we're headed, I think. And I was glad to get this article from my friend because he keeps talking about Roosevelt, and I'm like, oh, that's how opportune is that? Since I'm doing a class on Roosevelt. But it's
I look forward to reading it, Mike.
Yeah. And the other thing too is you think of one thing people talk about is Roosevelt's view of the world in the post-war world. Churchill, as much as they were good friends, Churchill kind of wanted to hang on to the old colonial attitude. Roosevelt wanted to free the world from that and let countries be free and be who they were and who they wanted to be on their own. We'll talk about that in a couple of weeks. So next Friday, we'll talk about Roosevelt's friends, but next Wednesday night, 7 o'clock, that's the 29th of April, I will email you all at 6:30, and we will look forward to having Catherine Smith present her Missy LeHand talk all the way from South Carolina. I'm amazed because she's got one of those notorious Southern accents, but she's able to flip on a Massachusetts accent pretty well. So she's excited to do this. I think you guys will be enjoying what she has to say. And like I said, if you want a first edition copy of a book signed by the author, she'll provide that opportunity for you as well. So that's coming up.
Awesome.
All right.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you so much. Sorry to miss your Wednesday, but this was great today.
No problem. Thank you. And glad we made that connection.
Yeah.
I'd say go Cornhuskers, but I'm not a big fan. I'm from Minnesota, so Yeah.
Go
Anyway,
Gophers.
go Gophers. Go Black Bears.
There you go.
Cowboys. There you go. I got 3 schools I can cheer for. So, all right, everybody, be good, be safe,
Bye. Thank you.
be good to each other, as Crocker says.
Yes.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.